All right, so conscious of the time, I think we'll get things on the road here, and if people straggle in, that's fine. They can catch up, and this will, of course, be recorded and put up on our site later. Some familiar faces in the house here, and that's good. If you haven't been to one of these before, these are our 30-minute quick takes, and the format typically is that for the first 15 minutes we'll go through the topic. In this case it's SQL migration and configuration for your SQL databases in relation to Archive Manager. And for the last 15 minutes we'll have sort of an open Q&A session where if you've got a question you can drop it down in the little question box and we'll go over them at that point. So feel free to just hold on to your questions till we're done the first 15, but when you've got them, just put them down to questions and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So, my name's Adam Silver, and I've spoken to some of you before. I've been working with Archive Manager for a long time, and today we're going to talk about something that we do come up with quite a bit. Your SQL databases are growing too big, and you want to move them either to a production server, or their own instance, or back from your own instance onto your archive server. We've seen it both ways. And so, there's a process to that. We're going to get started right here. Okay, so our goal is an overview of the steps required to migrate Archive Manager SQL databases to a new SQL host. And, it's a really straightforward process. We're going to go through it piece by piece. And if you have any specific issues or questions, just bring them up at the end and we'll go from there. We're going to start with locating the necessary database files. And I'm just going to flip over to my test server here. And we'll look at that. And I'll show you where we can find that. This is our archive server. Right now, we don't have SQL running on this particular test server. It's running on a main central server. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to that server down here. This is our main SQL box. So I've launched SQL Management Studio here. And I can see all the databases in the system logged in. Now, the databases we are really concerned about are three. We've got our Exchange database, and just ignore the test ones on this server, but we've got our straight Exchange database. Okay, we'll use our test databases because someone's been moving this around since last time I was in there, unless they're moved to the bottom. Oh, so they're at the bottom here. So these are the three databases. Let's ignore that little blip. These are the three databases we need specifically within Archive Manager. Our Exchange database, which is the database that holds onto all the information that populates into Enterprise Manager, as well as some of the file ID data that it requires when you restore or archive stuff. So that's an important piece. Your HSM database, which, as you guys know, the HSM is the core database in the system, and the relationship between those two, I'll just go into really quickly, is that the Exchange database holds a marker that points to a spot within the HSM where the actual item is. So when you restore or retrieve an item, it goes in the Exchange database, looks for a file ID. That file ID points to a particular ID in the HSM, and that's how it locates where in the HSM folders those items are. So we need that HSM database because it's sort of an index of our HSM folders, even though it doesn't contain the data itself. Empty roles DB is actually a new one that's only been around since version 6.0, and its sole purpose is to hold on to all of your search history and settings for Archive Web for each individual Active Directory login, so that when you use Archive Web on a different computer somewhere else, all of your history and your settings and your setup is still accessible. So this one's new. It used to be just Exchange and HSM. Now we want to move the empty roles DB again as well since version 6.0. So the first step we're going to need to do is locate the necessary files. So where on the hard drive are the archive, the database files? That's the first step. We're going to right-click on this database, and we would go into Properties and Files. So in Files, we get this nice little neat summary. And what we're interested in is we scroll to the right here. It's good to take note of the size while we're here too, because it'll give us the actual idea of the file size for each of the database and the log. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with SQL, another thing that's important to remember is for every SQL database, there are two files in the system. One is your database itself, and it's right here. And you'll see it just shows rows. This is your actual data. And one is a log. These two always have to be together. You can't have one without the other. If you're going to be attaching or detaching SQL databases, you always need the log file and the database file. And so we're going to scroll over to the right, and we want to find the path. This is the piece we need because we want to find out where the actual files are. The files are what we're going to move from place to place. So what we would do is just grab that. I'm going to write just Control-C and copy it, which you can do for the whole path there. And what we'll do is we'll go down here, and I would just actually go in and put it in. I've already done that in here, but I would just paste it in here and go to our server directory. By the way, it doesn't have to be in the SQL directory like it is here. Oftentimes the SQL databases are put, it could be on a SAN, it could be locally on a direct or a folder just called data or something similar. Anywhere you need it to be, that's for file's sake. It could be on another drive, but this will tell you where it is. And as we were talking about, we'll scroll down through here and find the ones we're looking for. We're looking for the Exchange database in this case, the first one. So ExchangeDB is the database file, and ExchangeDB log is the log file. So again, we need each one of these. We need both of these in order to do what we need to do. We can go ahead and repeat the process again on the other two databases. In this case, I happen to know they're in the same place, and usually they will be in the same place. So you can flick through them just to be sure. But 99% of the time, they're all going to be in the same directory. So since I know they're all in the same directory, I can go in here, I can find them all, make sure they're there. ExchangeDB log, ExchangeDB, the HSMDB log, and the HSM, these two, and the empty roles, a little further down. So empty roles and the log. So 2 files for every database. Go into the options files to find them. So what we want to do is we want to take these pieces and we want to move them from place to place. So now that we've found them, I'm going to flip back really quick to my slide. Look at the next step. So shrinking and detaching the databases. The next step, now that we know where they are, is to go in and move them, or get them prepped for moving. Flip back to that server real quick. So if we try to move these right now, it's going to tell us we can't. It's going to tell them they're locked up because right now SQL is running and it's using these files, and we need to move them, or copy them in this case. So what we're going to do is we're going to take another look at each one. In this case, ExchangeDB. We'll just use as an example. And while we're looking through this, one of the important things we want to do is take a look at the actual size of the file, like we were talking about earlier. Quite often the log file will be quite large, especially if you've got a large organization that you're archiving a lot of email. This log file can really grow into the gigs, tens of gigs. We've seen it up as far as 100 gigs before. And you really don't want to have to move 100 gigs of data from place to place. The log file, as long as SQL is running right now, is not really necessary. It's just keeping a long log of all the transactions in SQL. We don't need that when we're going to move it. So there's 2 things we want to do to shrink it down before we move it. One is we want to click on options, and the key here is recovery model. By default, when you build these things, they're in full recovery, and that's a SQL default. As soon as the databases are put in place by our software or anyone else, they're in full recovery mode, and that means it's logging the maximum amount of data. That's where you see these huge database logs. For our purposes, for Archive Manager, because our backups are all happening in sequence with the HSM folders, which don't have that kind of logging, we're not really interested in full recovery. So it's actually a good idea to check this and make sure it's in simple recovery. If it's in simple recovery, it's only going to be using a fraction of the space that it would be in full recovery. So you're only going to be getting into maybe a meg instead of 100 gigs. So big difference. We flip that into simple. After we flipped it into simple, we hit OK. And some people think this is really difficult. I'm not sure why, but it's actually quite simple. Before we're going to move them, we're going to right-click on the database. We're going to go to Tasks. We are going to shrink, because what we're going to do is we're going to discard all of the logs we don't need. Files. And we're going to make sure to change this file type from data to log. So we only want to touch the log. And it's going to show currently allocated space. In this case, my log's 3 megs. But again, if this log was 100 gigs, and it brings it down to 500K. If this log was 100 gigs and we hit OK, it'll spin, do its thing. You'd actually be saving yourself right there 100 gigs of space on the hard drive, even aside from the fact that you're moving it from place to place. So you'd actually go in and shrink them for each one. Same process. Make sure they're as small as they can be before we move them. Data, log, and OK. We just want to make sure also, go in there one more time on the rules DB, and make sure that's on release unused space because we don't need it. We want to get rid of it and save ourselves some space and some time. Okay, so they're all shrunk. The next step is just get SQL to stop using them. Obviously, you don't want to shut down SQL because you might have other databases running on there for different programs, other stuff like that. What we want to do is we want to detach these databases, so bring them right out of SQL. And so the way we do that is, again, in tasks, at the top, detach. So it's going to pop up a dialog. It's going to ask, it's going to say, this is the database. Do you want us to drop or update? I'll just push these out a little bit so everyone can see them. And we're not interested in updating statistics. We're trying to keep it as small as possible. But we do want to drop any connections that are attached to it. Keep in mind, while you're doing this particular detach, the archive server is going to be down. So you're going to want to drop that and hit OK. So it drops out of SQL. It's still there. All the data is fine. Nothing's happening. It's sitting on the file level. So I'll do the same with the other two. And by the way, you could just as easily reattach it if you want. So it's not a really high risk move here. You can detach and reattach these things as many times as you want. Drop the connections. Okay, so all three are gone out of this SQL server. It's not being used anymore, but the files are still here. They're right where we left them. And so in this case, we're going to want to grab them. And I always find, get the log file and the straight file. That's the MT roles, the HSM, HSMDB. If you've got really big ones, you might want to use a download manager or copy manager to move stuff over. It's up to you. These are tiny, so I would just actually drag them. And what I've done is I've opened up this shared folder on the archive server. And because I'm actually going to do it backwards, I'm going to archive or migrate from our big SQL server into our SQL Express instance on our archive server. So I've moved them, and I've actually just dragged them and copied them all over. So now we've got small log files, small files. We moved it all onto the archive server here at 242. And once it's moved, I'm going to go over to that server. So I can leave that SQL server behind. Again, I like to copy rather than move this stuff, so I've got copies on both sides just in case I get a bad copy into the destination server. I've got the original still intact. Of course, it's always good to have a backup regardless, but that's an extra step. So here we are on the archive server, and again, I've done an installation of SQL 2012 Express in here. So we've got this blank installation I've just put in, and we want to put our archive databases in there. So I've got the install folder open here, and all of our databases that we moved over from the other server. And the same way we detach them, we're going to go and attach them. So we click on databases, click on attach. We go and we find the location we're looking for. In this case, it's that shared folder install. And it'll automatically bring up the databases that are local. Now, keep in mind, these databases will only appear if you've got the log and the straight database file. You need both in place for it to show up. And it's only going to show you the log. It's not going to show you the log. It's only going to show the database. We want all three of these. So I'm going to pick the first one, hit OK. It'll add it to this little queue. You can actually add as many as you need to in the same dialog box. So HSM database and MT roles database. So we've got all three. It's going to verify that they've got their log files in place. Again, it won't work properly if they don't. And we're going to hit OK. And they all appear. And you see they're all here. Tables are all accessed. The data's all here. So as far as the SQL portion of this, that's all it takes. It's just to detach it, reattach it, and move it. So now we've got the databases over here, but the archive manager system itself is still looking at the old databases. You also still have to tell it where to look for the new database. So we'd open up configuration here. And so I'm just going to look at my instance name here. So Man for Exchange, SQL Express. We're going to go over here and we're going to go to the equivalent tab for each database. And by the way, this is Archive Manager configuration over here. Just open it up so you guys know what it is. I'm sure you're all pretty well versed in configuration this time, but Archive Manager configuration, each one of these tabs typically has to do with a database or has an equivalent database, except for search, which uses a local index instead. So your Exchange archive, that is your Exchange database, and you can see that here the provider is pointed to the old SQL server that we were on before, and table owner. We don't have to change anything except for the SQL server itself. So we're going to, and by the way, we're going to hit configure the database. We're going to go over to SQL. Our new server name is MAM for Exchange SQL Express, but if it happens to be on the same server you're on, you can actually get away with just typing local. Otherwise, you put MAM for Exchange up here, SQL Express. Exchange database, your table owners are going to change because all that migrates over with the databases. Windows authentication, that's great. We go ahead. Oh, and actually, now that I think of it, one thing we didn't do on this server is we haven't created a user for it to actually attach to. What we need in SQL. So we've got these new databases that we've brought in, but right now I'm not logged in as the administrator for the server. I'm actually logged in as the super user account. So what I need to do is make a login. So this is a step that you'll sometimes have to take, not very often in this case. So we actually already have a login in there. Just going to check the settings, make sure that this login is owned by these pieces. So server role, we do need DB creator. Don't necessarily need sysadmin, but if you can have it, it's nice. Some SQL database owners don't like having sysadmin on a lot of accounts, and that's fair. But it is nice to have if you can. User mapping. Yeah, just want to make sure it's on all three of those. And that's the owner of all three of those. Good stuff. Let's see what we've got. This is part of the troubleshooting I was going to get into. Okay, so in this case, it doesn't like the local. It says it doesn't like the server name. So we'll actually do the MAM for Exchange SQL Express, I believe it was the default that it puts in. MAM for Exchange SQL Express. So we're going to copy that. Okay. There it goes. So it didn't like the local in this case. Sometimes with 2012 it doesn't. So if that doesn't work and you're on the same server, you can just type in the actual server and instance name. And we're going to do the same thing over here. So SQL Server and for Exchange SQL Express. So empty roles DB, DBO, that all stays the same. And as soon as you hit next, it should lock on. If it doesn't lock in right away, there's usually something going on. And for Exchange, oh, typo. Okay, same thing, HSMDB, DBO, that's attached to our HSM system. And so now each tab for each database is pointed, again, directly at the databases, but now they're no longer on the old databases, they're on the new one. And we'll just launch it up to make sure it's connecting, all right? And by the way, that reload DA, that piece will often happen is with the first time you actually launch this thing after you connect, because it's lagging a little bit with its tests, and it's a standard message in Enterprise Manager that the database is taking a little longer to respond than usual. But as you notice, if you restart it the second time, that'll go away, and it's not a concern. So here we are, we're back in, and all of this data, everything we're looking at, the groups, jobs, retention, all this stuff's stored in that Exchange database. So, if we can't, let's disable users. But if we can't access that database, we're not going to see any of this. If a symptom of not being able to connect to the SQL database very well is if you click on any of these guys, you won't see any data at all. You won't see retention. You won't see your jobs. Stuff's all stored in those databases. And if you're not able to properly attach those databases, this will all be blank when you launch Enterprise Manager. So I've actually gone way over time. That's the basic process of it. Let's go over it real quick. Back to the slide. So we locate the database files. We shrink them before we detach them from the database, move them from place to place, attach them to the new database, open up Archive Manager configuration, and add all the pieces in. Just tell it where everything is step by step. And once it's locked onto the new database, it's, as far as the Archive Manager system is concerned, it's exactly the same as it was in the old one. And you've got your new SQL databases in place. Okay. So I'm going to throw it out into question period here, and I'm going to take a look down at the questions that are already in place. Is this related to SharePoint Edition or Exchange Edition or Files Edition in this case? Is that the entire question? Hang on. This is related to SharePoint Edition of Archive Manager. We are on SharePoint 2013 Enterprise. Is there a way to quickly restore the archive file directly from SharePoint list library? That's outside the scope of this quick take specifically. So, for a question to that one, go ahead and just open up a case and ask, and we'll get into the SharePoint Edition specifics. But it does bring up a good point. The steps that are involved in what we're looking at, even though it's Exchange Edition, they are the exact same steps for Files Edition and SharePoint Edition. They may have slightly different database names, and if you don't know which databases are attached to the system, you can always open up configuration, and they'd be all there in all the separate tabs. Flip back real quick and show you. So, these tabs are pretty common for all three editions of Archive Manager, and if you look at the initial catalog, that's going to show you the name of the database. Those are the databases you're going to need to move around. With the exception of the auditing database, never really needs to be moved unless you're running auditing, which very few people are. If you're running auditing, then you'll have to move that piece as well. But these steps are the same for all versions. All right. Any issues from SQL 2008? This is from David. R2 to SQL 2012. Nope. In fact, very few issues running from any of the versions, unless you're running from way back in 2000. And if you are moving a database up from SQL 2000, you might want to send us a case and a ticket, and we can help you out with the steps for that. But anything from 2005 up, you don't really run into problems with this process. It's a really easy one. Okay. What SQL versions do we support? We support up to 2012 R2 right now. I believe 2014 is on the way in our next version. Don't quote me on that directly. 2014 I know is in testing, but keep an eye out for version 7 when it comes out. The release notes will say whether or not 2014 is fully supported. But right now, officially up to 2012 R2. Should any services be stopped on the archive server before the database migration? They don't have to be. It's a good idea, and it's a good question. It's a good idea to go in and at least stop the jobs, because the one thing we don't want happening is we don't want it actually writing to those databases as we're moving them from place to place. So it's at least a good idea to stop the job. You have to be aware of the fact that when the SQL databases are migrating, moving around, people won't be able to retrieve archive mail. But we're less worried about that than the system writing into the database. So there's a couple things you can do. You can just stop the job. If you want to be extra sure, you can actually open up services, and I'll show you where you can go to be 100% sure. So in here, there's a service called MAM Direct Archive, and this is the guy that actually does the archiving. So from whatever source you're coming from, if you stop this service while you're running it, it will actually make it so that the system is incapable of putting anything in that database archiving. Another good step is actually, while we're here, is knock out the scheduler service, because this is your bridge from SQL into the system. It will also stop people from having error messages when they're retrieving, rather than just having them pop up. But it's a good idea to let everyone know that retrieval for archived mail, that type of thing, is going to be unavailable. So as long as we're not archiving directly while it's happening, we're okay that way. Provide actual relationship between Exchange DB and HSM DB. Sure, I'll get into it real quickly. So we're not going to demonstrate it because it involves a lot of scripts, but the Exchange DB holds a file identifier for every archived mail in the system. So I'll open up, if we have an archived mail in one of the groups, email archive users has archived a single mail, it puts a file ID, a unique file ID for that item in Exchange DB, which is what lets it show up specifically in archive over here in archive mode. You see, no, so test server is still doing its thing. So it puts a file ID marker in the Exchange DB that helps it identify in Enterprise Manager where that file is. But when you go to move to restore it and pull something out, or if somebody calls from the outside to retrieve it, so the ID in Enterprise Manager keeps track of the shortcuts in Exchange. But when you retrieve an item or restore it, it goes into the HSM database. And the HSM database, all it holds is the signposts to where items are in your HSM folder. So most of you have probably looked at your HSM folder at least. And within the HSM, you've got these folders, right? These folders are heuristic. They're all built in by date. But when you get down too deep, it's just these randomly assigned names. The HSM database holds a file identifier that points directly to one of these. So it's the HSM database that contains the redirect for the actual file in the HSM system. So Exchange DB reads the file ID, passes it off into the HSM DB, which locates that file in the HSM. Any other questions? I think I've exhausted all the ones I have here now. Anyone else? We'll get through this running out of time real quick, so I want to field anything else you guys have, or any questions about my answers to questions. I'm moving pretty quick, so. Okay, well, thanks, Joe. I think I'm going to wrap it up because we don't have any more questions, and hopefully I covered the majority of what you guys were looking for. If you have any questions outside the scope of what we're talking about, please just open a case. We're always happy to answer questions. And this quick take will actually be up on our knowledge base and probably within the next week or so. We've also got this particular process really well documented, so it should be in the knowledge base, and if you open up a case and ask us for it, we've got really good documents we can send you for it too. So hope everyone has a lovely day, and we'll talk to you all again soon on anything you might have, and thanks for attending.